The morning of February 21st, 1945, 2 days into the battle for Iwo Jima, a Marine sergeant crouched behind volcanic ash, black dust clinging to his sweat-soaked uniform, staring at a concrete pillbox 120 yards upslope. The position had been silent for hours, but he knew better. The Japanese inside were waiting, machine guns aimed at the kill zone. His rifle company had already lost 17 men trying to flank it. Artillery couldn't touch it. The naval bombardment had barely scratched reinforced concrete walls 4 feet thick, and the flamethrower team wouldn't get within 50 yards before the hidden defenders cut them down. Then his loader tapped his shoulder and slid an M6A3 rocket into the rear of their M9A1 Bazooka, a tube that commanders had dismissed months earlier as too inaccurate beyond 60 yards, a weapon designed for tanks, not fortifications. But desperation breeds innovation. The sergeant steadied the tube, aimed through the crude optical sight, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket screamed across the volcanic wasteland, 120 yards, 3 seconds of flight. Then impact. The shaped charge punched through reinforced concrete like a fist through paper, detonating inside the pillbox. Silence. Then screams. Then nothing. What happened next changed everything, because that single shot revealed something Japanese commanders never anticipated and American planners never predicted. The bazooka, a weapon mocked as a glorified pipe, could crack open Japan's most formidable defenses from distances no one thought possible. And the Marines who carried it were about to rewrite the rules of infantry warfare in the bloodiest island campaign of the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The M9A1 bazooka wasn't supposed to be a bunker buster. When it arrived in the Pacific Theater in late 1944, it was designed with one purpose: destroying tanks. The shaped charge warhead, using the Monroe effect to focus explosive energy into a superheated jet of molten copper, could penetrate up to 5 inches of armor plate. For that mission, it was revolutionary. A single infantryman could carry the power to knock out a steel behemoth. But bunkers were different. Japanese defensive positions on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa weren't thin armor plate. They were reinforced concrete, volcanic rock, steel doors, and earth piled 50 feet deep. These weren't targets you destroyed with a rocket designed for tanks. At least that's what everyone believed. The specifications told one story: maximum effective range against armor, 300 yards, against point targets, 100 yards. Accuracy beyond that dropped off sharply. The rocket's trajectory wasn't flat like a rifle bullet. It arced, it wobbled in crosswinds. The sights were rudimentary, a simple optical reflector added to the M9A1 that helped but didn't guarantee precision. Training manuals emphasized close-range engagements. Get within 60 yards for best results, 80 yards if you had no choice. Anything beyond that, you were gambling. But those manuals were written for tank warfare in Europe, not bunker warfare in the Pacific. What the manuals didn't account for was human adaptation. Marines facing fortifications that swallowed artillery shells and shrugged off naval bombardment didn't have the luxury of following doctrine. They needed something portable, immediate, and devastating. And they discovered the bazooka could be all three, even at ranges doctrine said were impossible. The secret wasn't in the weapon itself. It was in what the weapon carried. The M6A3 rocket, standardized in 1944, weighed 3.5 pounds. Inside its nose cone sat 8 ounces of pentalite, a blend of pentaerythritol tetranitrate and TNT. That explosive was shaped into a cone, lined with copper. Upon detonation, the Monroe effect transformed that copper into a jet traveling over 15,000 miles per hour, hot enough to melt steel and punch through concrete. The physics didn't care whether the target was a tank turret or a pillbox wall. If the rocket hit, the jet would penetrate. The problem was making it hit at distances where most crews assumed it couldn't. But on Iwo Jima, necessity became the mother of deadly innovation. The island itself was unlike anything American forces had encountered. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, ash, and hardened lava. No natural cover. No trees, they'd been stripped by Japanese engineers for lumber. No water except what fell as rain and collected in cisterns. Just black sand that shifted underfoot, making movement exhausting, and terrain that rose in jagged ridges honeycombed with defenses. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent 8 months transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress. He'd brought mining engineers from Japan to design an underground network of tunnels, bunkers, and fighting positions that stretched 11 miles beneath the island's surface. Pillboxes near the beaches were constructed from reinforced concrete, walls 4 feet thick, with narrow firing slits and earth piled high for additional protection. Blockhouses deeper inland were carved into solid rock, connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to reposition without exposing themselves to fire. Artillery pieces could be wheeled out of caves, fire a few rounds, then retreat behind steel doors impervious to counter battery fire. The volcanic ash that covered Iwo Jima, mixed with Portland cement shipped from the home islands, created concrete of exceptional quality. The Japanese had poured it into molds, reinforced it with steel rods, and built positions designed to withstand anything the Americans could throw at them. Admiral Raymond Spruance would later observe that Kuribayashi seemed to have fathomed an undefined principle of strategy, the proper ratio between area defended and strength in troops and installations. On a small island, every position could be fortified in depth. There was nowhere the defenders couldn't reach, no gap in their lines, and every single strong point had to be taken by force. Marines landing on February 19th had expected a brief campaign. Intelligence estimated 13,000 Japanese defenders. The actual number was closer to 21,000. They'd underestimated the tunnels, the interconnected defences, the sheer density of fortifications. What looked like a single pillbox from aerial reconnaissance was actually 3 positions linked underground, mutually supporting, with multiple exits. Destroy one entrance and defenders emerged from another. Artillery could collapse a cave mouth, but the garrison inside simply withdrew deeper and continued fighting. Naval bombardment, 72 days of it before the landing, had knocked out perhaps half the fixed fortifications. The rest remained, waiting. When the first waves hit the beaches, they discovered the volcanic sand absorbed the treads of vehicles, immobilizing tanks and turning the shoreline into a kill zone. Marines couldn't dig in. The ash collapsed under its own weight. They couldn't advance quickly. Every step sank ankle deep. And from the ridges above, Japanese gunners poured fire into the stalled landing force. Flamethrowers, the weapon that had cleared bunkers on earlier islands, couldn't reach the deeply buried positions. Explosive charges required someone to get close enough to place them, often a suicide mission against interlocking fields of fire. Artillery could suppress positions temporarily, but couldn't destroy them. The Marines needed something different, something portable enough for infantry to carry up slopes where vehicles couldn't follow, something powerful enough to crack reinforced concrete, something with enough range to engage bunkers before their defenders could cut down. The assault team. They needed the bazooka, but not the way it had been used before. The M9A, one that arrived on Iwo Jima in February 1945, was an evolution of earlier models. The original M1 bazooka, rushed into service in 1942, had been plagued with problems. Battery-powered electrical ignition systems failed in cold or damp conditions. Rockets sometimes stuck in the tube and exploded, killing the crew. The weapon was heavy, cumbersome, and its accuracy was questionable. By the time of Operation Torch in North Africa, General Eisenhower was expressing frustration that troops lacked adequate training and the rockets themselves were unreliable. But the Army Ordnance Department had listened. The M9, adopted in June 1943, replaced the battery system with a trigger-operated magneto that generated its own electrical charge, more reliable, safer. It added a manual safety switch. The wooden shoulder stock was replaced with a simplified skeleton stock, reducing weight. And critically, the M9 could be broken down into 2 sections connected by a bayonet coupling, making it easier to transport, especially for airborne troops who needed compact weapons. The M9A1 refined this further, improving the barrel coupling and adding an optical reflector sight that gave gunners a better chance of hitting targets at range. Production ramped up. By the end of 1944, over 277,000 M9A1 bazookas had been manufactured. Marine divisions were authorized 172 bazookas each, distributed throughout infantry regiments. By the time of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, nearly every rifle company had multiple bazooka teams. This ubiquity mattered. It meant that even if a team was killed, another was nearby. It meant commanders could assign bazookas to specific targets without depleting their reserves. It meant ordinary riflemen became accustomed to the weapon, learning its capabilities through observation, even if they weren't trained operators. The bazooka was no longer a specialized tool. It was standard infantry equipment, but standard doctrine still said it was for tanks and close-range bunker assault. What happened on Iwo Jima's black sand ridges would prove that doctrine wrong. The first attempts to use bazookas against fortifications followed the book. Get close, within 60 yards if possible. Aim for the firing slit or entrance. Fire and hope the rocket penetrated before defenders could respond. It worked sometimes. A rocket entering a bunker through a firing slit would detonate inside, the blast confined by concrete walls, devastating everyone within. But getting that close was the problem. Japanese defensive tactics had evolved since Tarawa and Peleliu. Kuribayashi had studied American assault methods and designed his fortifications to counter them. Bunkers were sited to deliver interlocking fire, each position covering its neighbors. Approaches were mined or swept by machine guns hidden in adjacent positions. The moment a Marine squad moved to assault one bunker, fire poured in from 2 or 3 others. Bazooka teams trying to advance into close range became priority targets. Japanese defenders recognized the tube instantly. They knew what it could do, and they knew that if they let a bazooka team get within 50 yards, their position was doomed. So they fired first. Cut down the gunner or the loader before the rocket could be aimed, force the team to withdraw or die. It was a brutal calculus, and in the first days of Iwo Jima, it worked in the defenders' favor. Casualties among bazooka teams were disproportionately high. What if they didn't close to 60 yards? What if they engaged from farther back, where Japanese fire was less accurate, where they had time to aim carefully? The optical sight on the M9A1 helped. It wasn't sophisticated, just a reflector that projected a reticle onto a glass lens, but it allowed gunners to estimate range and compensate for the rocket's trajectory. With practice, a skilled crew could hit man-sized targets at 100 yards. Bunkers were bigger than men. They didn't move, and if you missed the firing slit, hitting the wall still mattered. The shaped charge didn't need a small opening to be effective. It needed solid contact with the target. Concrete, steel, or rock, the jet would penetrate. Even a partial penetration could crack the structure, force defenders to evacuate, or create an opening for follow-up shots. One Marine gunnery sergeant, interviewed after the battle, described the moment of realization. They'd been pinned down for 3 hours by a pillbox on the approaches to Motoyama Airfield No. 2. Every attempt to flank it had failed. Artillery had been called in, 15 rounds of 155mm, and the position was still firing. He told his loader they were going to try something different. They crawled back 100 yards, found a shell crater for cover, and set up the bazooka on the crater's rim. The bunker was 110 yards away, beyond what anyone would call effective range. The sergeant aimed high, compensating for the rocket's drop. He exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger. The rocket arced across the open ground. For 3 seconds, he was certain he'd missed. Then the warhead struck the bunker's corner, right where the reinforced concrete met volcanic rock. The explosion was sharp, focused, and then, incredibly, the entire side of the pillbox collapsed. The shaped charge had cracked the concrete, and the weight of the earth piled on top had done the rest. The position was silent. His squad advanced and found 7 Japanese dead inside, crushed or killed by the blast. Word spread quickly through the rifle companies. The bazooka worked at long range. Not always, accuracy was still an issue, but often enough to matter, and the psychological effect was immediate. Japanese defenders inside bunkers, who had felt invulnerable behind 4 feet of concrete, now understood that even at distances where rifles couldn't threaten them, a single rocket could end everything. It changed the dynamics of every engagement. Suddenly, bunkers that had held up entire companies for hours could be neutralized by a 2-man team firing from 120 yards. Commanders began assigning bazookas not for close assault but for standoff suppression. Pin the bunker with rifle fire, keep the defenders' heads down, then have the bazooka team engage from a concealed position at range. The crew didn't need to charge forward into interlocking fire. They could take their time, aim carefully, and deliver a rocket that had a real chance of penetrating. And if the first shot missed, they had more rockets. The M9A1 could sustain a rate of fire approaching 10 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. In combat, 3 or 4 rounds per minute was more realistic, accounting for the need to move, find cover, and avoid counter-fire. But even at that rate, a bazooka team could fire 3 or 4 rockets at a bunker in the time it took a rifle squad to organize an assault. Each rocket that hit weakened the structure, cracked the concrete, forced defenders to shift position or evacuate, and every rocket that missed still forced the Japanese to hunker down, disrupting their ability to deliver effective fire. It was a grinding, methodical process, but it worked. By the 4th day of the battle, Marine units across Iwo Jima were employing bazookas as their primary bunker-busting tool, not because doctrine said to, because experience proved it was effective. The weapon designed to kill tanks had found a new purpose, and the Japanese, who had built fortifications they believed could withstand anything short of a direct hit from a battleship's guns, discovered that a tube carried by a 19-year-old private could unravel their carefully constructed defences. This wasn't the story anyone expected, not the Marines, who'd been told the bazooka was inaccurate beyond close range, not the Japanese, who'd dismissed American infantry weapons as inadequate against hardened positions, and not the planners in Washington, who viewed the bazooka as a stopgap anti-tank measure until better weapons could be developed. But on the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, where every yard cost blood, the M9A1 bazooka became something more than a weapon. It became a symbol of American adaptability, proof that technology mattered less than how you used it, and evidence that even the most carefully planned defenses could be defeated by soldiers willing to experiment, improvise, and refuse to accept that a target was untouchable. The laughter, if there ever was any, had stopped. The Japanese commanders, who might have once scoffed at the crude American tube, now faced the reality that their concrete fortresses were crumbling under its fire. And the Marines carrying those tubes, exhausted, terrified, determined, discovered they held more power than anyone had believed possible. The battle for Iwo Jima would rage for 36 days. Nearly 7,000 Americans would die. Every one of the 21,000 Japanese defenders would perish, all but a handful fighting to the death rather than surrender. It would be the only Pacific battle where American casualties approached parity with Japanese losses. But throughout those brutal weeks, the bazooka would be there, firing from ridges, from shell craters, from the mouths of captured caves, engaging bunkers at ranges that made no sense according to the manuals, but made perfect sense to men who needed to survive. And when it was over, when Mount Suribachi's flag raised and the island declared secure, the lessons learned would reshape how America fought for every island that followed. The M9A1 hadn't just knocked out bunkers, it had demolished assumptions about what infantry weapons could achieve. This is where the story begins, with a sergeant and a rocket and a concrete pillbox 120 yards away, with Marines discovering that the weapon they doubted could shatter defences everyone thought were impregnable, and with Japanese commanders, deep in their tunnels, realizing too late that the American tube they'd mocked was tearing their fortress apart, one explosion at a time. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It emerged through blood and trial, through Marines who watched their friends die and decided there had to be a better way. By the third week of February 1945, bazooka tactics on Iwo Jima had evolved into something resembling a dark science. Crews no longer thought of their weapon as simply a rocket launcher. They thought of it as a precision instrument for cracking concrete at distance. The key was understanding the rocket's ballistic arc. Unlike a rifle bullet that flew relatively flat for several hundred yards, the M9A1 rocket left the tube at only 80 meters per second, roughly 260 feet per second, slow by artillery standards. This meant gravity acted on it significantly during flight. At 60 yards, the drop was negligible. At 120 yards, the rocket would fall several feet below the line of sight. Experienced gunners learned to aim high, compensating instinctively. Some scratched marks on their optical sights to help estimate holdover at different ranges. Others used Kentucky windage, aiming at a point above the target based on experience and intuition. Wind complicated everything. The rocket's 6 fixed tail fins stabilized it in flight, but crosswinds could push it off course. A 15-mile-per-hour wind from the side could drift the rocket 2 or 3 feet at 100 yards. Marines learned to watch dust and smoke, to feel the wind on their faces, to adjust their aim accordingly. It wasn't scientific, it was art, being learned through repetition. Fire a rocket, watch where it hits, adjust, fire again. The learning curve was steep and measured in lives, but those who survived became extraordinarily proficient. Positioning mattered as much as aim. Smart crews sought elevation whenever possible. Firing downslope at a bunker gave them a better angle, allowed gravity to work in their favor, and often provided clearer lines of sight. They avoided silhouetting themselves against the sky, a rookie mistake that got you killed quickly. They used shell craters, destroyed vehicles, and collapsed bunkers as cover. And they never stayed in one position after firing. The rocket's backblast, a 15-meter cone of superheated gas and flame behind the tube, gave away their location instantly. Fire, displace, reload from a new position. It was exhausting work, but it kept you alive. The most effective teams operated with infantry support. Riflemen would suppress the target bunker, forcing defenders away from firing slits, while the bazooka crew maneuvered into position. Once set, they'd signal, the rifle fire would intensify, and in that moment when Japanese defenders were pinned, the rocket would fly. If it penetrated, excellent. If it missed, the rifle squad kept up suppression while the crew reloaded and tried again. This coordination required trust, communication, and veterans who understood each other without needing elaborate orders. In the chaos of Iwo Jima, where radio communications were spotty and officers were killed with disturbing frequency, small unit tactics like these became the backbone of the advance. Some crews specialized in specific shots. There was the gunner in the 5th Marine Division who became known for hitting firing slits at over 100 yards. His method was patience. He'd watch a bunker for 20 minutes, timing when defenders moved to the slit to fire, learning the rhythm of their activity. Then he'd set up, wait for movement, and put a rocket through the opening the instant a face appeared. 3 confirmed kills this way before a sniper ended his war. There was the sergeant who discovered that hitting the base of a pillbox, where concrete met volcanic rock, often caused structural failure. The shaped charge would crack the foundation, and the entire structure would shift or collapse under its own weight. He taught this technique to every bazooka crew in his company, turning bunkers into death traps for their occupants. And there were the desperate innovations born of necessity. When rockets ran low, crews learned to use white phosphorus rounds. These weren't designed to penetrate concrete, but they didn't need to. A white phosphorus rocket hitting near a bunker entrance would flood the position with burning chemicals and thick smoke, forcing defenders to evacuate or suffocate. Follow up with high explosive rounds while they were disorganized, or use the smoke as concealment for a flamethrower team to close the distance. The bazooka became a tool in a larger toolkit, each weapon supporting the others in a deadly choreography. The Japanese responded with their own adaptations. Kuribayashi's orders emphasized camouflage and deception. Dummy bunkers were constructed to draw fire, revealing American positions. Real bunkers had multiple firing ports at different heights and angles, making it harder for bazooka crews to predict where defenders would appear. Some positions were reinforced with additional layers of earth and logs, creating standoff barriers designed to detonate shaped charges prematurely before they could reach the concrete. These measures helped, but only marginally. The fundamental problem remained. A two-man American team with a tube and rockets could threaten a position that required 50 men to defend and weeks to construct. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima had entered the battle with grim determination, but also a certain confidence in their fortifications. They'd built a fortress. They had food, water, and ammunition stockpiled in the tunnels. They occupied the high ground, and they believed, based on Peleliu and other islands, that even if the Americans eventually took Iwo Jima, they would pay an unbearable price. The bazookas disrupted that calculation. Defenders who'd felt secure behind 4 feet of concrete now understood they were vulnerable. The sound of a rocket motor igniting, that distinctive whoosh, became a harbinger of terror. You couldn't see it coming. You had perhaps 2 seconds between hearing the launch and impact. Not enough time to take cover in a bunker that was itself the target. All you could do was wait and hope the rocket missed, or hope the concrete held. It rarely held. The M9A1s shaped charge was simply too effective. Upon detonation, the jet of molten copper penetrated concrete in microseconds, creating a hole several inches wide. Behind it came the explosive blast, confined by the bunker's walls, amplifying its lethality. Occupants died from the blast itself, from flying fragments of concrete and rock, from the concussive force rupturing internal organs, or from the superheated gas that followed the jet. Those who survived the initial penetration often faced a secondary horror. The structural integrity of the bunker was compromised. Cracks spread through the concrete, earth and debris began collapsing from above. And even if the position remained physically intact, the knowledge that another rocket could hit at any moment made continued defense psychologically unbearable. Japanese after-action reports, captured later in the war, reveal this dread. One lieutenant wrote that American rockets had destroyed the fighting spirit of his men more effectively than artillery bombardments. Artillery could be endured. You dug deeper and waited for the shelling to stop. But the rockets were different. They were personal, delivered by infantrymen you could sometimes see through your firing slit. And they came without warning, without the whistle of incoming shells that gave you time to brace. Just the whoosh, the impact, and the explosion that turned your fortress into your tomb. By the end of February, Japanese defensive doctrine on Iwo Jima had shifted noticeably. Bunkers that once fired at every target of opportunity now practiced strict fire discipline. Defenders would let American patrols pass rather than reveal their position to bazooka teams. Pillboxes operated at night when the rockets were harder to aim, and increasingly, Japanese troops preferred fighting from caves and tunnels where they could retreat deeper underground when rockets hit, rather than static bunkers that became coffins. But this shift came too late, and the island's geography offered limited alternatives. Kuribayashi's defensive plan had been built around fixed fortifications. The entire northern section of Iwo Jima was a warren of interconnected bunkers, blockhouses, and pillboxes. To abandon them meant abandoning the strategy that had made Iwo Jima so formidable. So the defenders stayed, and the bazookas kept firing, and the fortifications fell one by one in a grinding attritional struggle that consumed both sides. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battle for Hill 382 illustrates how completely the bazooka had transformed infantry tactics by early March. Hill 382, in the northern section of Iwo Jima, was the second highest elevation on the island and absolutely crucial to Japanese defences. It housed a radio and weather station, observation posts, and an enormous blockhouse that served as the headquarters for Colonel Chosaku Kaido, who commanded all Japanese artillery on Iwo. The entire hill was honeycombed with caves and tunnels. Artillery pieces hidden inside could fire, then withdraw before American counter-battery fire arrived. Machine gun nests covered every approach, and at the summit, reinforced concrete structures withstood days of naval bombardment without significant damage. The 3rd Marine Division was tasked with taking the hill. Initial attempts followed conventional tactics. Artillery preparation, then infantry assault, supported by tanks where the terrain allowed. The Japanese let them come, then opened up with devastating fire from concealed positions. Marines went to ground. Tanks were knocked out by anti-tank guns firing from caves. The assault stalled. Officers regrouped and decided on a different approach. They would use bazookas not as a supporting weapon, but as the primary assault tool. Every infantry platoon attacking Hill 382 was assigned at least 2 bazooka teams. Their mission was simple: identify every bunker, every cave entrance, every fighting position, and destroy it with rockets before the infantry advanced. The attack began before dawn on March 7th. As light broke, Marines moved into positions within 100 to 150 yards of Japanese defences. Then the bazookas opened fire. Not sporadically, as individual crews acquired targets, but in a coordinated barrage. Dozens of rockets streaked toward the hill in the span of minutes. Some missed, many hit, concrete cracked. Cave entrances collapsed. Defenders were killed or forced deeper into the tunnel system. And in the confusion, while Japanese gunners were reeling from the rocket impacts, Marine rifle companies surged forward. They didn't take the hill that day. Or the next. Hill 382 would require nearly 2 weeks of brutal fighting to secure. But the bazooka barrage had established a pattern. Suppress with rockets, advance, consolidate, repeat. It was methodical, bloody, and effective. Japanese defenders described it afterward as relentless. There was no respite. Even when they retreated into tunnels to escape the rockets, Marines would follow with grenades and flamethrowers. The static defense Kuribayashi had planned for couldn't function when every bunker was under constant rocket fire from multiple directions. Casualty rates tell part of the story. In earlier Pacific battles, flamethrower operators had some of the highest mortality rates of any infantry specialty. Getting within 20 or 30 yards of a bunker to use a flamethrower effectively was extraordinarily dangerous. On Iwo Jima, bazooka crews had lower casualty rates than flamethrower teams, despite being used far more aggressively. The reason was range. Engaging from 100 yards or more meant bazooka crews faced small arms fire and occasional artillery, but they weren't in the kill zone of point-blank machine gun fire. They could take cover, displace, and survive to fight another engagement. This mattered for morale as well as tactics. Marines volunteered for bazooka duty because it gave them agency. You weren't just a rifleman assaulting fortified positions with a weapon barely effective against concrete. You were a specialist with a tool that could genuinely threaten the enemy's strongest defenses. It was dangerous, absolutely, but it was dangerous in a way that felt survivable, skillful. You could get good at it, learn the weapon, learn the tactics, and increase your odds. That sense of mastery, however fragile in the reality of combat, helped men keep fighting through the horror of Iwo Jima. By mid-March, American forces controlled most of the island, but pockets of resistance remained. Japanese defenders had withdrawn into the most inaccessible terrain, the broken lava fields and deep ravines in the northern section called Bloody Gorge and the Meat Grinder. Here, terrain so rough that tanks couldn't operate and artillery had limited effectiveness became the final proving ground for bazooka tactics. Marines would spot a cave entrance 150 yards across a ravine, no way to approach directly without being cut down, so they'd set up a bazooka, fire rockets across the gap until the cave collapsed or defenders stopped firing, then mark it and move on. Systematic, exhausting, deadly. The last organized Japanese resistance ended on March 26th, but the lessons learned would echo far beyond Iwo Jima. Within weeks, American forces would land on Okinawa, facing even more extensive Japanese fortifications. And the bazooka would be there. Crews now trained in the hard-won knowledge from Iwo Jima. Engage at range when possible, coordinate with infantry, aim for structural weak points, use terrain for protection. The tactics that had been improvised in desperation became doctrine, taught to replacement troops arriving in the Pacific. Okinawa proved the universality of these lessons. The Japanese defenders there had built defensive lines anchored on ancient Shuri Castle, supported by ridges, caves, and bunkers even more elaborate than Iwo Jima's. The terrain was different, less volcanic ash and more limestone cliffs, but the principles remained. American infantry with bazookas could crack fortifications at distances that kept them out of the most lethal defensive fire. The campaign lasted nearly 3 months, from April through June 1945, and throughout, bazooka teams operated as a standard element of every infantry assault. Reports from Okinawa consistently praised the weapon's effectiveness against bunkers, noting that it had become indispensable for reducing fortified positions. The numbers are striking. During the battle for Iwo Jima, Marine divisions fired tens of thousands of bazooka rockets. Exact figures are difficult to establish because resupply was continuous and record-keeping under combat conditions imperfect, but estimates suggest over 50,000 rockets were expended on Iwo alone. Given the island's size, that's more than 6,000 rockets per square mile. Nearly every fortified position on Iwo Jima faced rocket fire at some point, and while not every rocket resulted in a destroyed bunker, the cumulative effect was devastating. Japanese defenses that had been designed to withstand months of siege fell in weeks, not because of overwhelming firepower from naval guns or aircraft, but because infantry squads carried weapons that could systematically dismantle them. The contrast with European theatre is instructive. In Europe, bazookas gained fame for engaging German tanks, particularly during the Battle of the Bulge and the advance into Germany. But they were often frustratingly ineffective against German heavy armour. A Tiger or Panther tank's frontal armour could sometimes deflect or absorb bazooka hits. Crews had to target weak points, sides, rear, or tracks. It required skill and luck. In the Pacific, against Japanese bunkers, the bazooka found its ideal target. Reinforced concrete was formidable, but it wasn't armour plate designed specifically to defeat shaped charges. And bunkers didn't maneuver. They stayed where they were, allowing patient crews to line up shots and engage repeatedly until penetration was achieved. This specialization mattered for post-war development. When the military analyzed lessons learned, they recognized that different theaters required different weapons. The result was the M20 Super Bazooka, introduced in the early 1950s for Korea. It featured a 3.5-inch diameter rocket with significantly more explosive power, designed to defeat Soviet armor. But the principles established with the M9A1 in the Pacific remained. Give infantry portable, powerful weapons they can use at tactically relevant ranges to destroy targets that would otherwise require artillery or air support. The modern descendants of the bazooka, weapons like the M72 Law, the AT-4, and Javelin missile systems, all trace their lineage back to those Marines on Iwo Jima, discovering that 120 yards wasn't too far after all. There's an irony worth noting. The bazooka was named after a novelty musical instrument, a crude horn used by comedian Bob Burns in the 1930s. The resemblance between Burns's tubular instrument and the M1 bazooka struck someone's fancy, and the name stuck. It was almost comical, this association between a comedian's prop and a weapon of war. But by the time of Iwo Jima, there was nothing funny about it. The bazooka had become synonymous with American infantry firepower, a symbol of the citizen soldier's ability to fight and win against entrenched professional armies. Japanese commanders, in their final reports and diaries, expressed grudging respect for the weapon. One officer, captured on Okinawa, stated that the Americans' rocket launchers had been far more troublesome than their tanks or artillery. He explained that tanks could be channeled into kill zones and destroyed with mines or anti-tank guns. Artillery was powerful but predictable. You could endure bombardments in deep shelters. But the rockets were carried by individual soldiers, could appear anywhere and turned every fortified position into a potential target. There was no defense except deeper digging and stricter concealment, and even those were only temporary measures. This admission reveals the weapon's true achievement. It wasn't just about destroying bunkers, though it did that effectively. It was about inverting the attacker-defender calculus. Fortifications had always given defenders an advantage. Thick walls, narrow openings, elevated positions. These forced attackers to expose themselves, to assault uphill into fire, to sacrifice lives to take ground. The bazooka didn't eliminate that dynamic entirely. Iwo Jima and Okinawa remained horrifically costly battles, but it reduced the defender's advantage significantly. A fortification that once required a company-level assault could now be neutralized by a two-man team. That shift, multiplied across hundreds of engagements, changed how battles unfolded. For the Marines who carried the M9A1, the weapon became an object of near-reverent affection. Veterans' accounts are filled with stories of bazookas saving lives, enabling advances, turning desperate situations into survivable ones. One private wrote home after Iwo Jima that his bazooka was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and he'd gladly carry it for the rest of the war if it meant he could keep his squad alive. That's not standard military sentiment. Soldiers rarely wax poetic about equipment. But the bazooka had earned that devotion through proven effectiveness under the worst conditions imaginable. There's also the human element of the crews themselves. Operating a bazooka required 2 men, minimum, a gunner and a loader. The gunner aimed and fired, exposed and vulnerable while lining up the shot. The loader handled the rockets, connected them electrically to the firing mechanism, and watched the gunner's back. The two had to trust each other absolutely. A fumbled load could mean missing a critical shot. A gunner who panicked or rushed could waste rockets the team couldn't afford to lose. The best crews developed an almost telepathic coordination. The loader would know when the gunner was about to fire from the tension in his shoulders, the stillness before the trigger pull. The gunner would trust that the rocket was properly seated without needing to check, keeping his eyes on the target. These partnerships, forged in combat, often became the strongest bonds men formed during the war. Stories emerged of loaders who threw themselves in front of gunners to shield them from fire, knowing the gunner's ability to aim was more valuable than their own life. Of gunners who refused evacuation after being wounded because their loader was still fighting and they wouldn't abandon him. This wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. It was the reality of small unit combat, where survival depended on the man next to you. The bazooka, requiring that 2-man team, created relationships that defined how soldiers experienced the war. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, nearly 500,000 bazookas of all types had been produced. 15 million rockets. The United States had built an arsenal of portable anti-tank and anti-fortification firepower, unmatched by any other nation. And it had deployed that arsenal into the hands of ordinary soldiers, trusting them to use it effectively without requiring years of specialized training. This democratization of firepower is uniquely American, rooted in the same philosophy that put rifles in the hands of Minutemen 2 centuries earlier. Give citizens the tools, teach them the basics, and trust them to innovate in the field. It worked at Lexington and Concord. It worked on the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima. The legacy extends beyond tactics and technology. The bazooka became embedded in American military culture as a symbol of infantry ingenuity. When faced with an impossible problem, a fortification that doctrine says requires heavy weapons to destroy, American soldiers don't wait for doctrine to catch up. They experiment. They adapt. They discover that a weapon designed for one purpose can be repurposed for another if you're willing to think creatively and take risks. That mindset, that refusal to accept limitations imposed by manuals or conventional wisdom, became a defining characteristic of American forces in World War II and beyond. The Japanese learned this lesson the hardest way possible. They had built fortresses. They had bled their engineers and laborers into creating defenses they believed impregnable. They had every reason to think those defenses would exact such a toll, that the Americans would reconsider the cost of continuing the war. And then a teenager from Iowa or Alabama or New York, armed with a tube that weighed 15 pounds and cost less than $20 to manufacture, would fire a rocket that shattered concrete, collapsed tunnels, and killed defenders who'd thought themselves safe. The asymmetry was devastating, not just in material terms but psychologically. All that effort, all that engineering brilliance, defeated by a weapon so simple it could be assembled from two pieces of metal tube. There's a broader story here about industrial warfare. The bazooka represented American manufacturing prowess at its peak. Simple design meant rapid production. Standardized components meant easy maintenance and replacement. Wide distribution meant tactical flexibility. And continuous improvement. The progression from M1 to M1A1 to M9 to M9A1 meant the weapon evolved based on feedback from the field. This iterative process, design, test, refine, deploy, happened faster for the United States than for any other combatant. Germany could produce technically superior weapons like the Panzerschreck, but in far smaller numbers and without the logistical infrastructure to get them to frontline troops consistently. Japan tried to develop similar weapons late in the war but lacked the industrial capacity and raw materials. The bazooka's success wasn't just about the weapon itself. It was about the system that produced it, distributed it, trained soldiers to use it, and supplied them with enough ammunition to employ it liberally. Consider the mathematics. One M6A3 rocket cost approximately $2 to manufacture in 1945. One Japanese reinforced concrete pillbox might require 500 man-hours to construct, tons of cement and steel, and weeks of work. Destroy that pillbox with 3 rockets, $6 of American ordnance, and you've achieved a cost-exchange ratio that would make any accountant weep with joy. Of course, war isn't purely an accounting exercise, but these ratios matter. They meant that America could afford to be profligate with rockets, encouraging crews to fire multiple rounds at each target rather than trying to conserve ammunition. And that profligacy translated into tactical aggressiveness. Marines willing to engage bunkers from the range because they knew resupply would come. More rockets were available. Use them freely and liberally. The Japanese couldn't match this. Even if they'd developed an equivalent weapon, they lacked the industrial base to produce it in meaningful numbers, and they lacked the tactical doctrine that would have allowed them to employ it effectively. Japanese military culture emphasized spirit, courage, and close combat. The idea of engaging an enemy from 100 yards away with a rocket launcher didn't fit their martial tradition. They preferred direct assault, the banzai charge, the bayonet attack. This worked in some contexts, particularly early in the war against poorly prepared opponents. But against Americans equipped with bazookas, machine guns, and artillery, it was suicidal. Cultural factors mattered as much as material ones in determining who won the Pacific War. The battle for Iwo Jima became a case study in military academies worldwide, not because of grand strategy or brilliant generalship, but because of small unit tactics that worked. The Marine Corps incorporated bazooka employment into its training curriculum, ensuring every infantry officer understood how to use the weapon effectively. Other nations studied the American experience and developed their own doctrines for portable anti-tank and anti-fortification weapons. The Soviet RPG series, Swedish Carl Gustaf, British LAW, all owe intellectual debts to the lessons Americans learned with the M9A1 in the Pacific. As the years passed and veterans aged, their memories of Iwo Jima remained vivid. Many spoke of the bazooka with a mixture of gratitude and haunted recollection. Gratitude because it helped them survive. Haunted because every time they fired it, they were killing men, even if those men were enemies trying to kill them. The shaped charge didn't discriminate. It burned through concrete and human flesh with equal efficiency. Crews who fired into bunkers sometimes heard the screams that followed. Penetration. They learned not to think about it, to focus on the mission, to remember that every Japanese bunker silenced meant fewer Marines dying on the approach. But the memories lingered. One veteran, interviewed 50 years after Iwo Jima, described firing a rocket into a cave and watching Japanese soldiers stumble out, clothes on fire, before collapsing. He said he still saw it in dreams. Not nightmares exactly, just memories that wouldn't fade. He didn't regret it. He knew it had been necessary. But he wanted people to understand that using the weapon wasn't clean or glorious. It was brutal, intimate killing at what felt like close range, even though doctrine called it standoff distance. The bazooka made war slightly more survivable for those who carried it. But it didn't make it any less horrific. This human cost must be remembered alongside the tactical success. The bazooka worked. It saved American lives by reducing the need for suicidal frontal assaults. It shortened battles that might have dragged on for months, but it did so by inflicting terrible casualties on Japanese defenders who died by the thousands in collapsing bunkers and burning caves. Neither side escaped the brutality. War's essential nature remained unchanged. Only the tools and techniques evolved. By late spring 1945, with Iwo Jima secured and Okinawa nearing its bloody conclusion, American planners were already considering the next step. Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan's home islands, was scheduled for November. Casualty estimates were staggering. Hundreds of thousands, potentially over 1 million American casualties, based on the resistance encountered at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And the planners knew that Japanese defenders on the home islands would fight even more fanatically than those on outlying territories. The whole population might resist. Every city might become a fortress. The bazooka would have been crucial in that nightmare scenario. Tens of thousands of Tenshu of pros, and them hundreds of thousands of rockets, distributed to infantry divisions preparing to fight house to house through Tokyo, Osaka, Hiroshima. Every building a potential bunker, every street a killing ground. The weapon that had proven itself in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima would have been tested in urban warfare on a scale never before seen. We'll never know precisely how that would have played out, because Operation Downfall never happened. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, combined with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, prompted Japan's surrender. The bazookas stayed in their crates. The invasion never came, but the weapon's legacy was secure. From its improvised origins in 1942 to its proven effectiveness in 1945, the bazooka had transformed infantry warfare. It gave foot soldiers the ability to destroy targets that once required artillery or air support. It enabled tactics that saved lives while achieving objectives. And it demonstrated that simple, reliable, mass-produced weapons could be more strategically valuable than complex, sophisticated ones. These lessons shaped military development for decades. The story of the bazooka, knocking out bunkers at 120 yards, is, at its core, a story about adaptation. About soldiers who refused to accept that a weapon couldn't do something just because manuals said it couldn't. About crews who learned through trial and error, through watching their shots impact, through adjusting aim and technique until they could hit targets everyone said were beyond effective range. It's a story about the ingenuity of ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. It's also a story about the limits of fortification. The Japanese had believed that concrete and steel could protect them, that deep enough tunnels and thick enough walls would make their positions invulnerable. They weren't fools. The engineering was sound. Under any previous standard of warfare, those fortifications would have been devastatingly effective. But warfare evolved. Technology created new threats. And the shaped charge, a physics principle discovered decades earlier but only recently weaponized, rendered their concrete walls less secure than they appeared. No defense is permanent. Every fortification eventually faces a weapon designed to defeat it. The cycle continues. For the Marines on Iwo Jima, the bazooka was more than technology. It was hope. Hope that they could take the next ridge without losing half the squad. Hope that the bunker that had killed their friends could be silenced without another frontal assault. Hope that they might survive this God-forsaken island and make it home. In the midst of a battle where hope was scarce, where every yard cost blood and the end seemed impossibly distant, that mattered more than specifications or doctrine. The bazooka worked. That was enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.